Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special and talk about a story carved not in books, but in stone and blood. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. The Great Valley lay ringed by mountains, a bowl of earth cradled by jagged peaks. Mists clung to the ridges in the early mornings, and when the sun lifted, it spilled light across lakes that shimmered like glass. At the heart of this land, the Aztecs had raised their capital, a city of canals and stone causeways that seemed to float upon the waters. To approach it was to see a dream given shape, temples climbing into the sky, markets crowded with every sound of life, and always the endless pulse of drums echoing between walls painted in red and white. But for all its beauty, this city lived beneath the shadow of the sun. For the sun was not a distant god of warmth and light. It was a hungering force, a fire that demanded to be fed. Without its nourishment, it would falter, it would darken, and the world itself would collapse into silence. The Aztecs believed this not as metaphor, but as truth as firm as the stone beneath their feet. Each sunrise was a victory stolen from disaster, a fragile reprieve bought at a terrible price. And so the city breathed with sacrifice. It was not an act of cruelty in their eyes, but of necessity. The gods had bled for mankind in the beginning of the world, and in return, mankind must bleed for them. The temples that rose above the city were more than monuments of power. They were altars where human hearts were given back to the heavens. To live beneath the shadow of the sun was to know that your life, or the life of your neighbour, or the life of a stranger captured in war, might someday climb those stone steps and never return. The people accepted this truth as naturally as they accepted the rains that nourished their fields, or the storms that split the skies with lightning. Children grew up hearing stories of the gods who had sacrificed themselves at Teotihuacan to bring the sun into being. They learned that the great orb above them would one day falter if men grew selfish, if offerings ceased, if blood no longer darkened the stones. It was not a choice to sacrifice, it was survival. At dawn, the city stirred with ritual. The lake reflected the first rays, golden and trembling. Priests, robed in black or painted with ash, climbed the temple stairs before the people had finished their morning meals. Smoke of copal incense curled upward, thick and sweet, clinging to the air like a veil. To breathe it in was to step half into another world, where the line between flesh and spirit blurred. The drums began their slow beat, steady as a heartbeat, and the people knew the day would begin as it always did, beneath the gaze of the sun, with gifts offered to keep it burning. Travellers from distant lands, allies and enemies alike, stood in awe of this rhythm. Merchants who came to Tenochtitlan often spoke later of its terrifying grandeur. They described the twin pyramids of the Templo Maya, their twin shrines painted in hues of fire and water, one for Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, the other for Tlaloc, the rainbringer. Between them, the stairways stretched upward, steep and narrow, until they vanished against the sky. At their feet, plazas opened wide, filled with thousands of people who gathered not out of compulsion, but belief. And in this belief, there was no hesitation. The Aztecs did not see themselves as cruel masters of fate. They were servants of a cosmic duty. Just as a farmer placed seeds in the ground and cut the earth to make it yield, so too must hearts be placed in the hands of gods to make the world continue. The sun rose not by chance, but because men and women had given their lives to fuel its fire. To them, The blood that flowed across temple steps was no different from the rains that fell upon the fields. It was nourishment. It was life. Still, to stand in that plaza was to feel the weight of dread. When the captives were led forward, their bodies painted, their faces bound, the air itself seemed to tighten. The crowd did not riot, nor did they cheer wildly. They murmured prayers. They swayed to the rhythm of the drums. They watched as the priests carried obsidian blades sharper than any metal. The stone gleamed in the light, black yet flashing with brilliance. The victim was stretched across the altar, and in a motion both swift and terrible, the blade opened the chest. The heart was lifted high, still beating, still red with the warmth of life, and the smoke of incense carried its spirit upward. The people did not turn away. They believed they were witnessing the turning of the heavens, the maintenance of existence itself. Children clutched the hands of their parents, learning what it meant to live beneath the shadow of the sun. Merchants whispered blessings. Soldiers looked on with pride, and rulers measured the strength of their empire in the number of offerings that could be given. And the numbers were vast. It is said that when a great temple was consecrated, captives were brought forth not by tens or hundreds, but by thousands. They were paraded in lines that stretched across the city, up the temple steps, down the other side, and back again. The drums never ceased. The priests did not rest. The sun overhead glared down, relentless, as if demanding more. To the Aztecs, these days were not spectacles of horror, but celebrations of cosmic balance, proof that their empire alone kept the world alive. But such a burden cast a long shadow. For if the sun could be kept burning only by human hearts, then every man and woman lived in debt. Life itself was borrowed, and repayment might come at any moment. To be captured in war was to forfeit your blood to the gods of another people. To be chosen in ritual was to step willingly or unwillingly into the cycle that bound heaven and earth. Even the rulers, draped in feathers and gold, were not exempt from the knowledge that all their splendour rested upon the blade of sacrifice. In the evenings, after the ceremonies had ended and the plazas had been washed, the city seemed almost ordinary again. Children played along the causeways, women sold food and cloth in the markets. Fishermen paddled across the waters to cast their nets. Yet beneath this everyday life, the rhythm of sacrifice remained, steady and unbroken, like a heartbeat that never ceased. Even in laughter, there was awareness. Even in joy, there was the quiet understanding that all of it, family, empire, existence itself, was fragile, held together only by the willingness to feed the sun. And so the people lived beneath its shadow, a shadow not of darkness, but of hunger. They built their lives around it, their festivals, their wars, their very understanding of the world. To question it was to question the rising of the dawn. To resist it was to invite the silence of a sunless sky. And no one could imagine such silence, for it would mean the end of everything, the collapse of time, the freezing of rivers, the falling of stars. Thus, beneath the shadow of the sun, the Aztec death cult was not a curiosity or an aberration. It was life itself, burning bright and terrible, as steady as the dawn, as endless as the drumbeat that echoed across the valley. The sun climbed higher over the valley, its light falling across the stones of the great city. Each ray seemed to press heavily upon the temples, as though the heavens themselves were watching, measuring, waiting. For to the Aztecs, the sun was never secure. It was not a steady, faithful guardian of the earth. It was fragile, flickering, a fire that threatened at every moment to fade. And behind it, hidden in the silence of the sky, were gods who demanded to be remembered, gods whose hunger was endless. The story of their hunger stretched back beyond memory, into the time before this world was born. The Aztecs believed that the universe was not a single, eternal creation, but a cycle of suns, each one rising and falling in turn. 4 times the world had been made, and 4 times it had been destroyed. By jaguars, by winds, by fire, by floods, each world had perished because the balance between gods and men had broken. The one who devoured the sun, or the one who abandoned it, left only ruin in the sky. And so this, the 5th sun, was not guaranteed eternity. It was fragile, precarious, held aloft only by the nourishment of blood. The gods themselves had shown the way. At the dawn of the 5th sun, in the sacred place of Teotihuacan, they had gathered in darkness. The sky was empty then, without light or warmth, and the world lay in silence. Each god was asked, who will sacrifice themselves to bring the sun to life? The proud god Tekuchistecatl, adorned in jewels, hesitated. The humble god Nanahuatzin, covered in sores, stepped forward. He leapt into the fire and was consumed. The flames burned fiercely, and from them the sun rose, blazing in the heavens. Tekuchistecatl, shamed, followed into the fire, but his light was pale and weak. Thus the moon was made to wander the night. But though the sun had been born, it would not move across the sky. It hung still, waiting. And so the gods gathered once more, and one by one they gave their blood, tearing open their flesh, feeding the sun with their own sacrifice, until it began to travel across the heavens. This was the lesson. Even the gods must bleed to sustain creation. How much more, then, must men? The people of the valley did not doubt this story, for they saw its echo in the world around them. The rains came only when Tlaloc was appeased, and if his demands were unmet, drought and famine spread like sickness. The corn rose tall only when the earth was fed, when offerings sank into its soil. Even death itself was not an ending, but a passage into the service of gods who required continual payment. A warrior who fell in battle was carried to the house of the sun, to rise each morning with its light. A woman who died in childbirth became as fierce as any soldier, her soul honoured as one who had given her blood to the future. To live was to owe, and to die was to repay. Among these gods, none hungered more fiercely than Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. Born fully armed from his mother's womb, he had fought his siblings upon his very first day, striking them down with a serpent of fire. From that moment, he demanded nourishment, not in whispers, but in roars. He required hearts torn from living bodies, blood streaming down temple steps, captives seized in battle and offered in his name. He was the sun's fire itself, and he would not forgive weakness. To honour him, the Aztecs waged wars not only for conquest, but for tribute of flesh. They called them Xochiaoyotl, the flower wars, battles fought not for land but for living offerings. Warriors carried prisoners home like garlands, each captive a bloom meant for the altar. Tlaloc too was insatiable in his own way. His gifts were rain and fertility, but he demanded the tears of children. It was believed that only their cries could soften his heart. And so little ones, dressed in bright garments, were led to his shrines, their weeping a sacred sound. The people believed that when their tears fell to the earth, the skies would open, and the fields would live again. Then there was Xipe-Totec, the flayed lord, who wore the skin of men as a garment. His rituals were brutal, yet they symbolized renewal. Just as the seed shed its husk to grow, so too must life be stripped and reborn. His priests clothed themselves in human skins, the flesh drying and cracking under the sun, until at last they were cast aside like husks, leaving behind new life. Mictlantecuhtli, lord of the underworld, demanded respect for death itself. He was not gentle. He was a skeletal figure, his jaw agape, his body adorned with bones and paper banners. To him were given offerings to ensure safe passage into the world below. Each god hungered differently, yet all were bound by the same truth. They required sacrifice. Without it, they would turn their faces away, and the world would wither. To resist them was to invite catastrophe, drought, famine, defeat in battle, the collapse of the heavens themselves. And so the city lived with this weight, shaping every act of life around divine appetite. Farmers planted with prayers not only to the earth, but to the gods, who might devour their harvest if angered. Mothers whispered blessings over their children, hoping their laughter would please Tlaloc more than their tears. Warriors marched into battle, knowing that death might mean either the honour of joining the sun or the terror of capture. Their blood spilled far from home. The empire itself expanded beneath this need. For the Aztecs, conquest was not merely about tribute of gold or goods. It was about feeding the gods. New lands meant new captives, new streams of blood to flow upon the altars. Each campaign promised not only riches, but the security of the fifth sun. Their armies moved with the certainty that without their victories, the sky would fail, the stars would scatter, and the world would collapse into endless night. The plazas of the city reflected this faith. Murals painted across walls showed gods feasting upon streams of blood, warriors carrying hearts to the heavens, serpents coiled around the sun. Carved stone displayed scenes of men kneeling before divine jaws, their bodies given willingly to eternity. The people lived surrounded by reminders that the gods were always hungry and always near. At night, when the fires burned low and the lake reflected the moon, the silence was heavy. The city seemed to rest, but in truth it watched. For the gods never slept. The moon itself was a reminder of the god who had faltered, Tecutistecatl, his pale light weaker than the blazing sun. To gaze upon it was to remember that hesitation was death, that only sacrifice gave strength. And as the people lay down to sleep, they knew the dawn would come only if the gods had been satisfied. The hunger of the divine was both terror and comfort. It was terrible because it never ended, because it demanded lives without mercy. Yet it was comforting because it gave meaning to every death, every battle, every offering. To be consumed by the gods was not destruction, but transformation. It was to become part of the eternal rhythm, to pass from fleeting flesh into the fuel of creation itself. And so the Aztecs lived their days in a world where every breath belonged not entirely to themselves, but to unseen beings whose hunger shaped the rise of the sun, the fall of the rain, the very turning of the stars. Beneath their temples, in their markets, upon their battlefields, this truth lingered. The gods had bled first, and now men must bleed forever. The city thrived in this shadow, radiant and terrifying, knowing that tomorrow's dawn would only come if the gods were fed tonight. The city rose from the waters like a vision, its causeways stretching across the lake, its canals gleaming with reflected light. But it was not the gleam of water or stone that lingered in memory. It was the sight of temples climbing skyward, their stairways steep and sharp, their summits crowned with shrines that seemed to pierce the heavens. These temples were not simply monuments to gods. They were engines of sacrifice, places where life itself was unbound and returned to the cosmos. At the heart of them stood the Templo Mea, the Great Temple. Its twin staircases split the pyramid like two veins, each one leading to a separate shrine, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, the other to Tlaloc, lord of rain and fertility. From below, the stairs seemed endless, climbing steeply toward the sky. At the summit, altars waited, stone slabs worn smooth not by time, but by the weight of countless bodies. Those who approached the steps felt the weight of generations pressing down upon them. For the stones themselves carried memory. They had absorbed the cries of captives, the chants of priests, the thud of drums that echoed like thunder across the valley. They had drunk the blood of thousands, their porous surfaces darkened by stains that could never be washed away. Even the rain, when it fell in torrents, seemed to run red upon those steps, as though the earth itself remembered what had been given. The plaza at the base of the temple stretched wide, able to hold tens of thousands of people. Here the crowd gathered not only to witness the offerings, but to participate in them through prayer, song and rhythm. They became part of the ritual, their voices joining the beat of drums and the rise of incense. The air thickened with smoke, with the metallic tang of blood, with the steady pulse of devotion. For to stand upon those stones was to stand in the centre of the world, the very place where heaven and earth met, where human lives were carried upward into the mouths of gods. Priests climbed the steps with deliberate slowness, their bodies painted black or red, their hair matted with dried blood. Some wore the skins of the sacrificed, their faces hidden beneath flayed masks. In their hands they carried obsidian blades, sharp as glass, shimmering in the sunlight. Captives were led behind them, their arms bound, their faces painted in colours that marked them for death. Some walked silently, their eyes fixed upon the sky. Others wept or cried out, their voices lost in the vast sea of sound below. At the summit, the ritual unfolded with a terrible precision. The victim was laid upon the stone altar, his chest exposed to the heavens. The priest raised his blade, and with a swift thrust, the obsidian tore into flesh. The heart was pulled free, still beating, and lifted toward the sun. The crowd below raised their hands, their voices rising in a low, unbroken chant. Blood spilled across the stone, running in rivulets down the steps, soaking into the earth. The body was cast aside, tumbling down the stairway, its limbs striking against the stone, until it came to rest in the plaza below. The people did not recoil. To them, this was the natural order. The earth was a hungry mouth, and blood was its nourishment. The temple steps were veins that carried offerings upward, connecting the mortal world with the divine. Each drop that stained the stone was a promise that the sun would rise again, that the rains would fall, that the cycles of life would endure. It is said that during the dedication of the great temple in the reign of Ahuitzotl, the stones drank more blood than ever before. Captives from conquered cities were brought in endless lines, their bodies ascending the steps only to fall again into the waiting crowd. Chroniclers claim that tens of thousands were sacrificed in those days, though the numbers blur in the haze of memory. What mattered was not the count, but the scale, the sense that the city itself had become a heart beating for the gods, each pulse marked by another life surrendered. The stones bore witness to it all. Each ceremony left its mark not only in the stains of blood, but in the grooves worn by countless feet, the scratches etched by tumbling bodies, the cracks darkened by sacrifice. To walk upon them was to walk upon history itself, a history written not in ink, but in flesh. Even the air carried memory. The smoke of copal incense rose like mist, sweet and choking, mingling with the iron scent of blood. It clung to the skin, seeped into hair and garments, lingered long after the ceremonies had ended. For those who lived in the city, it was as familiar as the smell of earth after rain, a constant reminder that life and death were woven together upon the temple steps. The drums beat without ceasing, their sound echoing across the valley, bouncing from mountain to mountain. They did not strike with wild rhythm, but with steady, measured force, like the heartbeat of the world. Each beat marked another offering, another moment in the endless exchange between men and gods. The people swayed to it, breathed to it, lived within it, as though their own hearts were tethered to the pulse of the city. But the stones themselves were more than instruments of ritual. They were symbols of empire. To conquer another people was not simply to claim their land or tribute. It was to carry their captives up the temple steps, to spill their blood upon the sacred stones, to show that even foreign gods could be silenced beneath the blade. The Templo Mayor stood as proof that the Aztec Empire was not only powerful, but essential, that without its ceremonies, without its sacrifices, the sun itself would falter. For those who came from beyond the valley, the sight was overwhelming. Envoys from neighbouring cities watched with awe and dread, understanding that resistance meant not only military defeat, but religious subjugation. The stone soaked in blood became a warning as much as a shrine, a message carved into the very heart of the city. The gods are fed here, and they demand obedience. And yet, to the people of Tenochtitlan, the stones were not terrible, but sacred. They were the foundation of life, the place where the world's fragile balance was maintained. To sweep them clean, to scatter petals across them, to climb them in prayer. These were acts of devotion as natural as planting maize or drawing water from the lake. The stains were not shameful. They were holy, proof that the city had fulfilled its duty, that the cycle of sacrifice continued unbroken. At dusk, when the ceremonies ended and the shadows stretched long across the plaza, the stones cooled, but they did not forget. The marks remained, dark against pale surfaces, silent reminders of the day's offerings. The city settled into quiet, the lake reflecting the fading light, the mountains darkening into silhouettes. Yet even in silence, the stones whispered of hunger, of duty, of the endless exchange between mortal flesh and immortal fire. Night fell, and the stars appeared, each one a reminder of the gods who had given themselves at the dawn of creation. The people looked upward, knowing that those same gods watched still, their hunger unquenched, their demands eternal. And beneath their gaze, the stones of the temple waited, ready to drink again. Across the valley, the mountains stood like guardians, their peaks sharp against the sky. Within their embrace, the city shone, its markets bursting with colour, its temples climbing skyward, its canals glinting beneath the sun. Yet beneath this brilliance, an unseen current flowed, stronger than wealth, stronger than armies. It was fear. Fear was the lifeblood of empire, as essential as the rivers and rains. The Aztec dominion stretched wide, binding together countless cities, villages, and kingdoms. Tribute poured in from every corner, gold and cotton, maize and cacao, feathers of brilliant birds, jaguar pelts, obsidian blades. But tribute alone did not sustain the empire. Tribute was wealth. Fear was power. Fear ensured obedience. Fear prevented rebellion. Fear filled the plazas with captives ready for the altars. The source of this fear was not hidden. It stood in the very heart of the capital, visible for miles, the towering temples, the plazas vast enough to hold tens of thousands, the skull racks lined with the faces of the sacrificed. To an outsider, the sight was unbearable. Rows upon rows of human skulls, sun-bleached and silent, grinning eternally from wooden frames. They were not hidden away, but displayed openly, a warning carved from bone. Each skull was a story, A warrior taken in battle, a prisoner marched in chains, a sacrifice carried out beneath the beating drums. Together they formed a wall of memory, a reminder that the gods were never satisfied, and neither was the empire. It was this display that gave Aztec power its terrible weight. A conquered people could pay their tribute in goods, but always they knew their sons and daughters might be taken for more sacred payments. To resist was not merely to risk defeat in war, it was to invite the wrath of gods who demanded flesh. The Aztecs understood the machinery of fear, as well as they understood the rhythms of agriculture. They knew that to govern was not simply to rule through armies, but to remind every subject that their lives rested in the hands of those who could command the gods. And so the empire staged its ceremonies with grandeur, ensuring that even the faintest whisper of resistance would be drowned out by the memory of blood cascading down temple steps. Armies were the veins of this system. Warriors were not only fighters but harvesters. They set out in disciplined ranks, their bodies adorned with eagle feathers or jaguar pelts, their faces painted with lines of war. Each warrior carried not just weapons, but ropes for binding captives. Victory was not counted in corpses, but in prisoners. For every captive meant another offering, another proof of divine favour. To seize an enemy alive was an act of greater honour than to strike him dead. For a living body was worth more than a fallen one. This pursuit of captives shaped the very nature of Aztec warfare. Battles were arranged not only for conquest, but for the purpose of taking prisoners. Alliances were tested in ritualized conflicts, known as flower wars, where both sides agreed to meet in combat, knowing that the outcome would not be measured by territory gained, but by the number of bodies led back in chains. Such wars were not wasteful in the eyes of the people. They were sacred harvests, feeding the insatiable appetite of the sun. And so fear spread not only from conquest, but from ritual itself. For neighbouring peoples, the threat was constant. If the empire wished, their warriors could be taken in the next campaign, their families paraded in the capital, their blood spilled upon foreign stones. Resistance was crushed not only with armies, but with memory, the memory of what awaited those who stood against the empire. Within the capital, fear was transformed into awe. The people of Tenochtitlan did not see themselves as victims of their gods, but as chosen custodians of the sun. They believed the balance of the world rested on their shoulders, that only their sacrifices kept the fifth sun alive. This conviction gave them unity, but it also gave them a weapon. To declare themselves guardians of the cosmos was to place every other city in their shadow. Obedience was not only political, but cosmic, for to deny tribute was to risk the unravelling of existence itself. Tribute lists recorded with careful precision what each conquered city owed. Some were required to send goods, others to send warriors, others to send captives for sacrifice. These lists were not suggestions, but chains, binding distant lands to the heart of the empire. Tribute was collected not only by tax collectors, but by soldiers, and behind every tally stood the silent faces of the skull racks, watching, reminding. The fear was not without beauty, for the ceremonies, though terrible, were also magnificent. The plazas filled with music, with feathers shimmering like jewels, with dancers who moved as if they carried the sky itself upon their shoulders. The spectacle was overwhelming, drums pounding like thunder, conch shells wailing like the cries of spirits, incense thick as fog. For a moment, the people felt themselves part of something larger, something eternal. Yet at the centre of it all was death, waiting, watching, never denied. The empire's rulers understood this balance well. Moctezuma, Ahuitzotl, and the kings before them knew that their strength was measured not only in armies, but in sacrifices performed upon the great temple. Each ruler sought to outdo his predecessor, to consecrate new temples with offerings so vast that the very stones shook beneath the weight of blood. To reign was to feed the gods. To feed the gods was to prove one's right to reign. And yet, fear was not only for outsiders. It lived within the city as well. Every man knew that to fail in war, to be taken prisoner, meant to climb the temple steps as an offering. Every woman knew that childbirth, though sacred, carried the risk of death, and that such a death was a gift to the gods. Even children were not beyond the reach of fear, for their tears could summon the rains, and their lives could be claimed by Tlaloc's priests. In every home, in every street, the possibility of sacrifice lingered, not as distant threat, but as part of the fabric of existence. Still, this fear was not despair. It was transformed into devotion, into identity, into pride. The Aztecs believed themselves chosen to carry the heaviest burden of the world, to sustain the sun, to feed the heavens, to keep the cycle turning. Their fear was woven into their glory, making them both victims and masters of the gods' hunger. And so the empire thrived. It expanded outward like a great shadow, its reach extending over valleys, mountains, rivers, and coasts. Each conquest fed the stones of the great temple. Each tribute strengthened the illusion of cosmic stability. But beneath this brilliance, beneath the feathers and gold and songs, the truth remained simple. The empire was an edifice built upon fear, and fear was fed by blood. As the sun sank and the mountains darkened, the city did not rest. Fires burned on the temple tops, their glow visible across the lake. The drums slowed, but their echoes lingered. The skull racks gleamed faintly in the starlight, white against the dark. And the people slept with the knowledge that tomorrow, and every tomorrow, the empire would rise again. An empire that lived, and ruled, and endured by feeding on fear. Across the waters of Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan appeared as a vision rising from the mirror of the lake, an island city bound to the mainland by great causeways, its markets crowded, its canals alive with canoes heavy with goods, and above all else, its temples wearing into the heavens. No sight impressed foreign visitors more than these structures, built not as homes for mortals, but as stairways for the gods themselves. The Mexica had transformed stone into a language. Their pyramids, each terrace carefully measured, each stairway steep and unrelenting, spoke of power that reached beyond men. To stand at the base of the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, was to feel dwarfed not only by architecture, but by belief itself. The temple rose in layers, painted in vivid hues, flanked with serpents carved in stone, its steps leading to twin sanctuaries at the summit. There, fires burned for the two great forces that ruled the Mexica cosmos, Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Every detail was designed to bind the earthly world to the celestial. As the sun climbed the sky, its rays struck the temple's peak, illuminating the shrines where offerings were made. When storms rolled across the valley, lightning seemed to crown the sanctuary of Tlaloc. The temple was not simply built of stone, it was built of symbolism, a mountain crafted by human hands to mirror the sacred mountains of myth, where gods had once brought fire and water to mankind. But the grandeur was more than symbolic. These temples were theatres of ritual, stages upon which the drama of sacrifice played out for all to see. The steepness of the stairs was no accident. Captives forced to climb them became part of the spectacle, their slow ascent a visible reminder of their surrender to the gods. Thousands of eyes in the plaza below followed each faltering step, their anticipation rising with the captive's climb. At the summit, Where the sky seemed to open, the ritual found its climax. Hearts were lifted to the heavens, blood spilled down the stairs, and the stones themselves seemed to drink. The city's skyline bristled with such temples, though none rivaled the Templo Mayor in scale. Each neighbourhood had its shrine, each deity its dwelling. Taken together, they gave the impression that the city was not built for men at all, but for divine inhabitants who demanded constant presence. From dawn to dusk, smoke rose from incense burners, drums marked the hours of prayer, and processions wound through the causeways, carrying offerings upward. In these temples, architecture was inseparable from ideology. To build higher was to declare devotion. To enlarge a sanctuary was to proclaim that the gods had grown more demanding. The Templo Mayor itself was rebuilt multiple times, each enlargement swallowing the last, as though the empire sought to outdo itself in stone, just as it did in conquest. Layers of older temples lie entombed within the foundations, each one a fossilized record of an earlier age, each expansion a testament to the endless hunger of both gods and rulers. For the Mexica, the temple was more than a sacred mountain. It was the axis of the world, the place where the earth below, the heavens above, and the underworld beneath all touched. When a priest raised a blade of obsidian to the chest of a captive, he did not believe he was ending a life. He believed he was opening a door, sending a spark of blood and breath into the cosmic order, ensuring that the sun would rise and rains would fall. The temple was the hinge of that door, the place where such exchanges were possible. And so, life in Tenochtitlan unfolded beneath these rising structures. Markets bustled in their shadows. Children played along causeways with the pyramids in their sight. Travellers approaching the city from the distant hills glimpsed their white stone, gleaming long before they reached the gates. The temples stood as constant reminders of the empire's foundation, faith expressed through sacrifice, belief etched in stone, power elevated above the waters of the lake. Those who climbed the steps as pilgrims carried offerings of maize, flowers, or incense. Those who climbed as captives carried only their own bodies, yet both roles affirmed the same truth, that the gods dwelled above, and that to reach them one must rise, breathless, along the temple's stairs. The city seemed to breathe with this rhythm, inhaling life at its base, exhaling death at its summit. The construction of such monuments required vast resources. Stone was quarried from distant hills, transported across causeways by teams of labourers. Timber beams, lime for plaster, pigments for paint, all were gathered through tribute, the empire channeling the wealth of provinces into its temples. Every block laid in place spoke of conquest. Every layer of mortar was bound with sweat of subjugated hands. To build temples rising toward the sky was to make the empire itself rise, one stone at a time. Priests, clad in dark robes and crowned with feathered headdresses, moved within these sanctuaries as intermediaries between mortal and divine. Their lives were bound to ritual, their days structured by chants, fasts, and ceremonies that maintained the delicate balance of the cosmos. For them, the temple was not only a place of offering, but a dwelling of duty, where sleep was scarce and sacrifice constant. Travellers who entered Tenochtitlan often described the city as otherworldly. Spanish chroniclers, arriving decades later, would stand in awe at the sight of pyramids gleaming in the sunlight, their stairways alive with motion, their summits crowned with fire and smoke. To them, it seemed a city designed not for earth but for heaven. Yet behind that beauty lay a truth that could not be ignored. The temples were engines of sacrifice, each one a reminder that divinity demanded blood. The people themselves did not shrink from this reality. To them, the rising temples were protective, guardians that anchored their world. As long as the gods were fed atop those heights, life below would endure. Maize would sprout in the fields, rains would return each season, and the sun would blaze across the valley. Without them, existence itself risked collapse. And so, day after day, the rituals continued. Processions wound their way upward, chants echoed across the city, and the temples watched over it all, unyielding, eternal. Their steps were worn smooth by countless feet. Their stones had darkened by the traces of what they had consumed. To stand at their base was to feel the weight of centuries, the weight of belief, the weight of a people who had bound their fate to structures that climbed into the heavens. The temples of Tenochtitlan rose not only from stone and mortar, but from fear, faith, and duty. They stood as visible promises to the gods, promises renewed with every drop of blood that touched their stones. And as they reached skyward, they reminded every soul who gazed upon them that the empire itself was built on a pact with forces greater than men, a pact written in hearts and carried upward with every sacrifice. The temples that pierced the sky did not stand empty. Their steps, steep and relentless, were meant to be climbed, and their altars were meant to be fed. For this, the empire needed victims, and so the captives came, drawn from the farthest corners of Mesoamerica, marched across valleys and rivers, dragged through causeways toward the heart of the city. They were the lifeblood of the rituals, bodies turned into offerings, prisoners transformed into bridges between mortals and gods. The wars that fed Tenochtitlan did not always aim to destroy. Often they aimed only to capture. Warriors who fought under the banners of the Mexica were measured not simply by the strength of their arms, but by the number of enemies they could take alive. It was said that a man who returned from battle without prisoners returned in shame, while the one who brought captives was celebrated, his name carried in song. To capture was to secure honour, for only through captives could the temples fulfill their hunger. And so, the battlefields of the valley became hunting grounds for lives. Armies met not with the intent to annihilate, but to snare. Weapons were designed with this in mind: obsidian-edged clubs that could wound without killing, nets that could entangle, spears that slowed rather than ended. Warriors locked eyes with enemies and sought to subdue them, binding their arms, dragging them back through the dust. The chaos of war became a theatre of capture, where every man knew he fought not only for survival, but for the gods. When the fighting ended, long processions began. Captives, stripped of their weapons and bound at the wrists, were herded together. Their faces carried different stories, some proud even in defeat, others broken by exhaustion, some silent, others crying out to distant homes they would never see again. Chains were not always iron, but cords of maggy fibre, twisted tight, strong enough to hold as men stumbled forward. Columns of the defeated wound their way toward the capital, guarded by warriors whose painted faces and feathered crests marked them as victors. These processions were more than transport. They were messages. As the captives passed through towns, the people watched, and the empire's power was made visible. Mothers clutched their children tighter, elders whispered of caution, and young men saw with their own eyes the price of resisting Tenochtitlan. The sight of captives led in chains was itself a ritual, a performance of submission that reinforced the empire's reach. When the captives reached the causeways that led to Tenochtitlan, they entered a new world. Ahead of them, the city rose from the waters, shimmering with temples and palaces. For many, it must have seemed like walking into the mouth of a giant beast, each step a step deeper into inevitability. The people of the capital gathered to witness their arrival. Markets paused, processions swelled, and drums announced their entrance. To the citizens of Tenochtitlan, the captives were both trophies and sacred vessels, destined for the heights of the temples. At times, the arrival of captives was marked with spectacle. Warriors paraded their prisoners through the streets, painting them, dressing them in ritual garb, and binding them to platforms where the public could see. Children peered through the crowd. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Priests moved among the captives, sprinkling them with incense, as though consecrating them before their ascent. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that soon the captives would climb the steps of the Templo Mayor, where their hearts would meet the waiting blades. The rituals that followed were carefully orchestrated. Captives were not slain in haste, but prepared like offerings upon an altar. Their hair was often adorned with feathers, their faces painted in symbolic colours, their bodies transformed into living embodiments of gods. Some were made to dance before their deaths, moving to the sound of drums, as though they were not prisoners, but divine presences. Others were forced to play roles in elaborate ceremonies, enacting myths before their final sacrifice. The Mexica did not see this as cruelty, but as elevation. In death, the captive became more than a man. He became fuel for the universe. The journey from battlefield to altar was thus not only physical but spiritual. To be captured was to be chosen, to become part of a cosmic exchange in which mortals paid the gods for the continued existence of the world. Yet for the captives themselves, bound and beaten, the weight of chains must have been heavier than any promise of divinity. Their feet blistered on the causeways, their eyes met the endless stone of the temples, their breaths grew short as the drums thundered louder. The people of Tenochtitlan watched not with pity but with reverence. The captives' suffering was necessary, their fate inevitable. Each chained prisoner reminded the city that its empire was secure, that the gods were being served, that the sun would rise again tomorrow. The sacrifice of strangers was the assurance of survival for the community. In this way, the captives became both victims and saviours, unwilling pillars holding up the cosmos. Yet behind the grandeur and the chants, there lingered the silence of human despair. Among the captives marched men torn from their homes, warriors who had once believed themselves invincible, fathers who knew their families would never see them again. Some whispered prayers to their own gods, others held their silence, others still raged against their fate. Chains did not only bind their bodies, they bound their stories, carrying them toward an end from which no resistance could save them. For the Empire, however, these chains were threads in a vast tapestry. Each captive was a stitch, binding together the Mexica's vision of cosmic order. Without them, the temples would stand empty, the gods unfed, the sun in danger of faltering. With them, the Empire thrived, its rituals renewed, its citizens reassured. Fear and faith marched side by side in those processions, each step of the captives a reminder of the cost of empire and the depth of devotion. And so, the chains led onward, across causeways, through crowded plazas, up the steep and narrow stairs of the temples, and they carried bodies and lives to the summits. There, beneath the blazing sky, the captives would complete their journey, not as warriors, not as fathers, not as sons, but as offerings, their last breath rising like smoke, their blood soaking into the stones that had already absorbed countless before them. The sight of captives led in chains was never rare in Tenochtitlan. It was part of the rhythm of life, as regular as the changing of seasons, as certain as the rising of the sun. The empire needed them, the temples demanded them, the Golspki de Balls away sought them. Each procession was both an ending and a continuation, one life closing so that the cycle of the cosmos could remain unbroken. The chains were not only instruments of restraint, they were symbols. symbols of victory, of submission, of the empire's unyielding will. To the Mexica, they were the ties that bound the human world to the divine, ensuring that men and gods remained locked together in a pact sealed with blood. And as long as captives walked those causeways, the pact endured, and the empire stood firm beneath the shadow of the sun. In the hands of the priests, the world was opened by stone. Not just any stone, but obsidian, black glass born from fire, sharp enough to split flesh with a whisper. The Mexica did not need iron, nor bronze, nor steel. They had the earth's own volcanic gift, a substance sharper than anything forged in a smith's fire, capable of slicing clean through skin and muscle until it touched the very chambers of the heart. Obsidian had been revered long before the rise of Tenochtitlan. Across the valleys of Mesoamerica, it was shaped into arrowheads, spear tips, and blades. Yet in the empire of the Mexica, it took on a role greater than mere weaponry. It became the instrument of communion, the tool that carried the breath of mortals upward to the gods. Knives of obsidian were not only tools of death, they were extensions of the divine will, their edges tracing the fragile boundary between human life and cosmic balance. The priests who wielded them treated these blades with reverence. They were washed, blessed, anointed with incense before being raised in ritual. Each knife was more than a shard of stone. It was an object alive with sacred energy, believed to channel the very essence of the deities. When the obsidian edge pierced the chest of a captive, the act was not seen as violence, but as release, freeing the heart so it might beat one last time in the open air before the watching heavens. The crafting of these knives demanded skill. Obsidian does not bend or forgive mistakes. It fractures, it shatters. A single strike with a stone hammer could yield a perfect flake, thin as a leaf and sharper than a surgeon's scalpel, or it could crumble into useless fragments. The artisans who worked this volcanic glass understood its temperament, coaxing from it blades long enough to be hafted into wooden handles, or small enough to fit in the hand of a priest. Each fragment gleamed like night itself, polished until it caught the light of fire and sun. Their beauty was deceptive. To look upon an obsidian knife was to see both darkness and brilliance. In its depth lay the memory of eruptions, mountains that had torn themselves apart, earth that had bled molten stone. In its edge lay silence, death delivered swiftly, without hesitation. For the captive led to the altar, the glint of obsidian was the final sight before the sky. The ceremonies themselves unfolded with precision. A captive was stretched upon the sacrificial stone, limbs held firm by assistants. The priest raised the knife high, its blade flashing in the sun, and drove it downward with practiced speed. The chest split open, ribs parted, the heart lifted free while it still pulsed with life. With each motion, the obsidian fulfilled its purpose, not as an instrument of cruelty, but as the bridge between mortal and divine. Blood flowed across the altar, down the grooves of the temple steps, staining the stones dark red. Yet to the Mexica, this was not horror, but harmony, the world fed and sustained by the sharpness of volcanic glass. Obsidian blades served beyond the temples as well. Warriors carried maquihuitl, wooden swords lined with rows of obsidian teeth, each strike capable of cutting through flesh, severing limbs, or crippling an enemy. Yet even in war, the goal was often capture, not slaughter. The edge of obsidian wounded cleanly, disabling without ending, leaving the victim alive for the rituals to come. The battlefield, like the temple, was governed by the stone's edge. The symbolic power of obsidian stretched into mythology. Legends told of gods who armed themselves with such blades, striking at the darkness to carve out light. The sharp stone was seen as a fragment of the divine body, as though the earth itself had offered a piece of its essence to sustain creation. To wield it was to partake in this mythic cycle, to act with the authority of gods who had once cut open their own flesh to give life to the sun and moon. The people who gathered to watch the ceremonies knew the knives by sight. They knew the way their edges caught the light, the way priests raised them like torches of shadow. Children growing in the city's streets saw obsidian not only as a material of tools and weapons, but as the essence of sacrifice itself. The word carried weight, the sight evoked awe, and the knowledge that such a blade might one day claim one's heart lingered always in the mind. Yet, within this reverence, there was also a quiet fear. Obsidian was brittle, it could break. Sometimes the blade shattered in use, scattering black fragments across the altar. To the Mexica, this was not accident, but omen, a reminder that even sacred tools were fragile, that the balance of the cosmos was delicate, that the gods themselves required vigilance. The broken blade was gathered carefully, its shards kept, never discarded carelessly, for each piece still bore the memory of ritual. Obsidian linked every level of Mexica society. Farmers used its flakes for knives in the kitchen, artisans shaped it into tools, warriors bore it into battle, priests offered it to the gods. From the humblest household to the loftiest temple, the black stone was ever present, an unbroken thread weaving the empire together. Yet nowhere was its role more potent than on the altars, where it turned men into offerings and sustained the eternal bargain between gods and mortals. When foreign eyes first saw these knives, they recoiled. To them, the gleaming black glass was a crude substitute for metal, a primitive material compared to the iron blades of Europe. Yet when they witnessed its sharpness, its precision, its role in ritual, they recognized that obsidian carried not poverty, but purpose. It was chosen not because no other material was known, but because none could match its sacred sharpness, its perfect marriage of beauty and terror. In the hush that followed a sacrifice, when the heart had been lifted high and the drum still thundered, the obsidian knife lay stained with blood, its black surface gleaming red in the sun. To the priest, it was a vessel emptied and ready again. To the crowd, it was proof of devotion, the assurance that their city had fulfilled its duty. To the captive, it had been the final truth, the last cold kiss of the gods. Thus, the knives of obsidian held a place unlike any other. They were tools of survival, not in the way of ploughs or fishing nets, but in the way of cosmic necessity. Without them, the temples would stand mute, the gods unfed, the balance undone. With them, the empire thrived, its rituals unbroken, its pact renewed with every heart laid bare. And so the black stone endured, its edge never dulled, its presence never absent. Obsidian was more than matter, it was destiny carved into glass, a reminder that the empire's greatest strength and deepest fear lay in the sharpness of a blade born from fire. The city never fell silent. Even in the cool hush before dawn, when the canals reflected the stars and the chinampas lay in shadows, there were sounds that drifted faintly across the water. A dog barking on a causeway, a vendor shuffling through the streets, a priest whispering prayers before the first light touched the temples. But when the rituals began, all other sounds seemed to vanish beneath the roar of drums. They were not instruments of entertainment, not meant for festivals of joy or idle gatherings. These drums carried the pulse of the gods themselves, their deep voices shaking the air, filling the chest, and carrying far beyond the city's edges. They were made of hollowed tree trunks, skinned with stretched hides, carved with designs of serpents and jaguars, adorned with symbols that marked their sacred purpose. To strike them was to awaken the heavens. To hear them was to feel the breath of creation tremble. The largest among them, the Huehuetl, stood tall upon carved legs, its surface painted with images of deities and warriors. Its skin, drawn taut, responded to each strike with a resonance that seemed to ripple through stone and bone alike. Alongside it, the Teponaztli, a slit drum shaped like a log, sang in higher tones, its hollow body echoing with sharp wooden beats that cut through the low thunder of its companion. Together, they wove a rhythm that was not music in the sense of melody, but power given form in sound. When sacrifices were to be offered, the drums began before the captives even climbed the temple steps. Their first beats rolled like distant thunder, announcing to the city that the time had come. Men and women stopped in their tracks, listening as the rhythm swelled, their pace quickening, their strength deepening. The sound did not merely mark the ritual, it became part of it, a force that guided the procession and carried it forward. Captives bound in procession felt the drums as much as they heard them. The vibrations shook through the ground, through the wood of the platforms on which they were carried, through the very air they breathed, so that each beat seemed to strip away a layer of resistance, reminding them that they marched not toward chance, but towards certainty. To resist the pull of the drum was to resist the very order of the universe. The people gathered below the temples felt it differently. For them, the drums confirmed the balance of the world. Each strike was reassurance that the gods were being honoured, that the pact was upheld. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed, as the sound rolled over the square. Old men leaned on their canes and nodded in solemn recognition. The rhythm carried memory, reminding them of battles won, of droughts ended, of the fragile line between survival and ruin maintained through these rites. The rhythm did not remain steady. It rose, shifted, broke into complex patterns, echoing the flow of ritual itself. Slow, heavy beats marked the beginning, when the captives were led forth. Faster, sharper bursts followed, echoing the chants of priests and the rising tension of the moment. Then came a rolling thunder, relentless and unbroken. As the blade was raised, the chest was opened, and the heart was lifted skyward. In that instant, the drums were not background. They were the heartbeat of the ceremony itself. From the causeways miles away, travellers could hear the echoes. The sound travelled over water, carrying across the lake to villages that looked upon the great island city with awe and unease. Farmers bent over their crops, paused as the low thunder rolled past. Merchants on their canoes looked up, knowing what was taking place. For them, the drums were not only a reminder of the empire's might, but also a warning of its reach. The sound was proof that even from afar, the heart of Tenochtitlan commanded attention. Within the temples, the drummers themselves were figures of focus and devotion. They trained to sustain rhythms for hours, their hands striking until skin split, their arms trembling from the effort. Yet they did not falter. To let the rhythm weaken was to risk breaking the bridge between worlds. Their faces were painted, their hair adorned with feathers, their bodies moving in time with the beat. They were more than musicians. They were conduits, translating the language of sacrifice into sound that even the gods could hear. There were moments when the drums did not simply accompany the sacrifice, but led it. In certain rituals, the tempo dictated the pace at which captives ascended the steps. Each beat was a step, each strike a measure of inevitability. In this way, the rhythm itself became ritual law. Even if a captive stumbled, even if fear gripped their limbs, the drum carried them upward, relentless, inevitable. The psychological weight of the drums cannot be overstated. To the onlookers, they created awe, reverence, even pride. To the captives, they crushed hope, drowning it beneath a tide of sound too immense to ignore. Imagine the way the chest feels when thunder crashes overhead, the way the air itself seems to shake. Now imagine that thunder repeating, unbroken, inescapable, reminding you with each strike that the gods are waiting. At night, when torches flickered on the temple steps and the ceremony stretched long into darkness, the drums took on another character. Their sound mingled with the cries of captives, the chants of priests, the hiss of burning copal incense. The darkness made them seem even deeper, as if the earth itself was speaking. Flames leapt in rhythm with the beats, shadows danced on stone walls, and the people below stood transfixed, caught between terror and devotion. It was said that the gods themselves demanded this sound. Just as the heart's blood nourished them, so too did the rhythm of drums call them forth. In myth, when the world was first set in motion, the gods struck drums to summon life and movement. Every ceremony echoed that first divine rhythm, reminding all that without sound, the cosmos might fall silent again. Even after the final heart was lifted, and the last body tumbled down the steps, the drums did not stop at once. Their thunder rolled on, steady, echoing, as if to seal the pact. The sound lingered in the ears of all who listened, haunting them, even as they returned to their homes. Children lay in bed with the echoes still in their minds, while elders closed their eyes, assured that the cycle would continue. For long after the sacrifices had ended, the drums carried the memory of what had been done. Foreign eyes, when they came, struggled to describe this sound. To them, it was not music but noise, a terrifying barrage of rhythm that shook the earth. They could not understand how the people of the valley found order in it, how they felt safety in its thunder. To the Mexica, it was neither strange nor frightening. It was the sound of balance, the voice of the gods, the reminder that blood had been given and the sun would rise again, and so the drums of the empire remained constant, as much a part of Tenochtitlan as its canals, its markets, its towering pyramids. To live within the city was to live within their reach, to measure one's days not by silence, but by the echoes of thunder rolling from the temples. Their voices did not merely accompany history, they carved it, beat by beat, rhythm by rhythm, until every stone, every street, every life resonated with their sound. The drums that echoed like thunder were not meant to fade. They were eternal, rolling across the waters, climbing into the mountains, thundering through the memory of a people who saw in each strike not terror, but the promise that the world still turned. When the thunder of drums reached its peak, and the temple steps glistened with the proof of devotion, the fire at the heart of the plaza came alive. Flames leapt skyward, twisting in colours of orange, red and blue, their light flickering across painted stone and casting tall shadows that stretched like living beings across the square. Around this blaze, the dancers gathered, not as entertainers, but as extensions of the ritual itself, their movements carrying the weight of centuries, their bodies echoing the myths of creation. The fire was more than light. It was the breath of the gods, a living presence that consumed offerings of copal resin, flowers and blood. As the smoke curled upward, it was believed to carry prayers beyond the sky, straight into the realm of the divine. The dancers circled it, weaving in and out, stamping feet against stone, their steps timed with the rhythm of the drums, each movement a story, each gesture a petition to the unseen. They were not dancers in the way that foreign eyes might imagine, not performers seeking applause or beauty. Their bodies became language, telling tales too ancient for words alone. Some leapt high, arms outstretched, imitating eagles diving from the heavens. Others crouched low, stamping with ferocity, embodying jaguars prowling through the night. Feathers shimmered in the firelight, painted faces gleamed with sweat, and every bead of motion carried meaning. To watch them was to see myth made flesh. The circle they formed was unbroken, a wheel of human figures spinning around the blaze, their rhythm unrelenting. The fire crackled and roared as if responding to their energy, flaring higher with each turn. Sparks shot into the night sky like stars torn loose, and still the dancers moved, their bare feet slapping against the stone with a sound that joined the drums in harmony. It was not only warriors and priests who danced. In these ceremonies, chosen maidens, clad in garments of white cotton or adorned with bright feathers, stepped into the circle. Their movements were softer, swaying like reeds in the wind, arms lifted as if offering themselves to the night. They embodied water, fertility, and the gifts of the earth, balancing the ferocity of the warriors with grace. Together, the circle became the cosmos itself, sky, earth, water, fire, turning endlessly before the watching gods. Children too sometimes danced, especially in ceremonies to Tlaloc, the rainbringer. With small steps they mimicked raindrops, their laughter swallowed by the drums, their innocence a reminder that sacrifice was not only about death, but about renewal. To the Mexica, these dances were not distractions from bloodshed, but its completion. For what was spilled on the altars had to be transformed into harmony, into rhythm, into the movement of life around flame. The costumes of the dancers were as much a part of the ritual as their movements. Feathers from quetzals, macaws, and eagles shimmered like living rainbows in the firelight. Shells rattled with each step, creating a sound like falling water. Skulls carved of bone hung from belts, clattering in time with the music. Every garment, every headdress, every painted line of pigment had purpose. They invoked gods, spirits, and animals, blending the human with the divine. And yet, beneath the beauty, there was a tension that lingered. For many of the dancers, the performance was not an end, but a prelude. Some would dance and later bleed. Some would dance and later climb the steps of the temple to meet the obsidian blade. The fire they circled was the same fire that would consume their offerings, the same flame that connected them to gods who were never satisfied. Their movements carried not only devotion, but resignation. The fire itself became a silent witness. Its crackles filled the gaps between drum beats. Its heat pressed against the skin of those who drew too near. Smoke curled into the night sky, sometimes caught by the wind and blown across the faces of the dancers, stinging eyes, clinging to hair, embedding itself into the fabric of their garments. The scent of copal mixed with the metallic tang of blood, forming an air both intoxicating and suffocating. To breathe it was to breathe devotion, to breathe the very essence of the ritual. Observers, gathered in crowds at the edge of the plaza, watched with rapt attention. They swayed unconsciously with the rhythm, feet tapping, hearts beating in time with the drums and the dance. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others clapped hands in reverence. The dance was not performed for them, yet they were pulled into its gravity, as though the circle of fire had widened to include every soul in the square. At certain moments, the dancers broke into paired formations. 2 by 2, they mirrored each other's movements, one crouching low, the other leaping high, symbolizing balance, life and death, earth and sacrifice and renewal. At other times, the circle tightened, the dancers pressing closer to the fire until sparks leapt onto their garments and hair, which they bore without flinching. Pain was part of the devotion, part of the offering. The rhythm never ceased. The drums thundered, the rattles shook, the shells clattered. Yet there was another rhythm beneath, the rhythm of breathing, of dozens of chests rising and falling, of bodies growing as one living organism. It was as if the city itself was dancing, stone and water and blood given form in the movements of men and women around flame. As the night deepened, the dance grew more frenzied. Movements became sharper, leaps higher, steps faster. The fire roared, fed by fresh wood and offerings thrown into its heart. Sparks exploded upward, illuminating the temple above, where priests stood silhouetted against the stars. The boundary between human and divine seemed to blur in these moments, as if the gods themselves had stepped down to join the circle, their presence hidden within feathered headdresses and painted masks. For some dancers, trance took hold. Eyes rolled back, limbs moved without conscious thought. Sweat poured down faces that no longer felt the weight of exhaustion. The rhythm carried them beyond themselves, into realms where the gods whispered and shadows revealed secrets. To outsiders, it may have seemed madness, but to the Mexica, it was communion, the closest a mortal could come to touching eternity without the blade. Eventually, the circle would break. Not suddenly, but gradually, as exhaustion claimed bodies and the fire's roar gave way to steady crackles. Dancers slowed, swaying more than stepping, their garments heavy with sweat, their limbs trembling. One by one, they drifted to the edges of the plaza, collapsing onto stone, eyes glazed, chests heaving. The fire remained, its flames still licking the night, but the frenzy gave way to silence, broken only by embers. Yet even in this stillness, the echoes of the dance lingered. The crowd remained quiet, unwilling to disturb the afterglow of what they had witnessed. Children leaned against their mothers, their eyes heavy but fixed on the glowing coals. Elders nodded with solemn satisfaction, knowing the gods had been honoured. And above it all, the temple loomed, its shadow cast across the plaza, its stones still gleaming faintly with the blood of sacrifice. The dancers had circled the fire not for themselves, but for the cosmos. Their movements affirmed that the pact held, that the blood spilled had purpose, that life would continue for another day beneath the rising sun. In their stamping feet and outstretched arms, in their leaps and falls, in the sweat and smoke that clung to their skin, the universe itself had turned, and when at last the fire burned low, when only embers glowed like red eyes in the darkness, the plaza returned to its quiet hum. But those who had seen the dance, those who had felt the rhythm in their bones, carried its echo with them into the night. It was not a performance to be remembered as spectacle. It was a fragment of eternity, lived for a moment, then surrendered to the silence that always followed devotion. The fire in the plaza would eventually fade, its embers reduced to glowing fragments scattered across the stone. Yet even as the last sparks dimmed, another ritual stirred, one that carried a weight all its own. This was no dance of warriors, no blood spilled by hardened captives, but something that reached deeper into the marrow of the people, touching both fear and necessity. It was the offering of children given to Tlaloc, the Lord of Rain, the Master of Waters, the one whose favour meant life and whose anger meant famine. In the Valley of Mexico, nothing was more precious than rain. The floating fields, the chenampas, blossomed only when the skies opened. Maize, beans, squash and flowers, all the food of the people, depended on the clouds. And yet rain was never certain. The sun beat down with merciless heat, seasons shifted with little warning, and droughts came like invisible armies, starving the land until hunger gnawed through the empire. For this reason, Tlaloc was both worshipped and feared, his name whispered with reverence, his image carved into stone, his temples were raised beside those of Huitzilopochtli himself. The offerings given to Tlaloc were unlike others. Warriors and captives fed the sun, but children, innocent and unscarred, belonged to the rain. Their small lives were believed to please him most, their tears sacred, their cries not signs of cruelty, but of divine acceptance. To hear a child weep before the altar was to hear the first drops of rain falling upon thirsty soil. They were chosen with care. Not every child could be given. Some were selected for beauty, others for health, still others because their families had been marked by priests as bearers of suitable offerings. Often they were dressed in bright colours, cloaked in garments of blue and white to mirror the waters of rivers and skies. Their faces were painted with symbols of waves and raindrops, their hair adorned with feathers, their wrists hung with small rattles that chimed with each step. In this way, they became more than children. They became embodiments of rain itself. The journey to Tlaloc's shrines was long and solemn. Some of these shrines stood far from the heart of the city, high on the mountains where clouds gathered thickest. The most feared among them was Mount Tlaloc, whose summit touched the heavens, a place where mist clung to the rocks and lightning often split the sky. To climb this mountain with children at hand was to walk into the dwelling place of the god himself, where each step echoed with unseen power. On such journeys, priests carried sacred effigies, clay jars painted with faces, offerings of maize and flowers, and bundles of copal to burn. The children were led at the centre, their small hands clutching each other, their wide eyes glancing between the fire of torches and the shadows of the trees. The people who walked with them did not jeer or mock. They did not curse their fate. Instead, they treated them with reverence, for these little ones carried the salvation of the many upon their shoulders. Without their tears, fields would wither. Without their cries, rivers would dry. The rituals themselves were terrible in their tenderness. At the summit of the mountains, or in the courtyards of Tlaloc's shrines, the children were placed before the altar. Priests sang songs of water and sky, their voices rising in tones that swayed like rainfall. The crowd murmured prayers, and the air grew heavy with incense, so thick that it blurred the edges of sight. Then the moment came. The children were offered, their bodies laid down, their cries piercing the night, or echoing through the mist. It was said that the louder their tears, the greater the promise of rain. Some accounts tell that priests even sought to encourage weeping, for it was the tears themselves that nourished Tlaloc most. The people did not turn away. They listened, and with each sob, they believed the earth was being watered, that the skies were being softened. Cruelty and compassion mingled in a single breath, for in those cries the people heard not suffering, but the first harvest sprouting from the soil. The bodies of the children did not go to waste. They were buried in sacred places, at springs, near rivers, within fields, returning them directly to the domain of Tlaloc. The earth embraced them as seeds, and from their resting place, life was expected to rise. Each burial site became a point of devotion, a place where the presence of the god was felt most strongly, where offerings of flowers and food continued long after the ceremony ended. For the families of those chosen, the grief was immense, yet intertwined with honour. To give a child to Tlaloc was to sacrifice more than blood. It was to surrender part of one's own soul. And yet, within the heartache, there was pride. These families were believed to have been chosen by the gods themselves, set apart to carry a burden that would save the many. Neighbours looked upon them with awe, and their names were remembered long after the child was gone. The empire itself depended on such rituals. When drought stretched across the valley, when maize wilted and lakes receded, the ceremonies grew larger. Entire groups of children were brought forth, their cries echoing together like storms gathering on the horizon. The desperation of the people demanded it, and the priests answered with fervour, their chants rising louder, their blades flashing sharper. In those moments, the city did not shrink from horror. It embraced it as necessity. Even in times of plenty, the offerings did not cease. For to ignore Tlaloc was to invite disaster, to risk his anger turning the rains away. The ceremonies were reminders that prosperity itself was fragile, that the balance between feast and famine rested on the favour of unseen powers. To skip a sacrifice was unthinkable, for the cost of neglect could be famine that stretched across the valley, swallowing thousands in hunger. Foreign eyes, when they first learned of these rituals, recoiled. They saw only cruelty, only the agony of innocence destroyed. Yet to the Mexica, there was no cruelty in giving what was most precious to secure the survival of the many. The children's tears were not wasted. They were rain itself, drawn from the deepest well of humanity, and poured onto the earth, so that countless others might live. The image of those ceremonies lingers even now. Small figures in bright garments, standing before towering priests, flames casting shadows across their painted faces, the drums rolling low, the chants rising high, the sobs piercing through the smoke of incense. And beyond, the mountains standing silent, their peaks wrapped in mist, as though the god of rain himself leaned close to listen. The children of Tlaloc were not forgotten. They were remembered in prayers, in songs, in the whisper of rain upon leaves. Every drop that fell was a reminder of their cries, every harvest a testament to their sacrifice. They became part of the eternal cycle, woven into the fabric of the world itself, their innocence feeding rivers, their voices echoing in storms. And when the rains did come, when thunder rolled across the valley, when lightning split the skies, when water poured from the heavens in torrents, the people did not see tragedy. They saw proof. Proof that the god had heard, that the tears had been answered, that the children's offering had not been in vain. In that storm, their cries lived again, transformed into life itself. The children of Tlaloc were more than victims. They were the smallest keepers of balance, the fragile messengers between human desperation and divine mercy. And though their lives ended before they could bloom, their legacy endured in every field that greened after drought, in every stalk of maize that rose tall, in every mouth that found food where famine might have been. In their brief lives and their final cries, they had become rain. From the cries of children offered to the rain, the path of ritual led always back to the sun. For above all other gods, it was the sun who demanded the richest portion, the brightest flame, the deepest river of blood. And unlike Tlaloc, who listened for the tears of the young, the sun was a god who hungered for the beating hearts of men. To keep him alive in the sky, to ensure he rose each morning and strode across the heavens, the Aztecs believed they must nourish him with the very essence of life itself. The empire lived beneath that blazing eye, knowing that its warmth gave maize its golden ripeness, yet also fearing that it could wither the same fields if left unsatisfied. The sun was both protector and destroyer, and in its daily journey lay the endless struggle between light and darkness. Each dawn was a victory, each dusk a warning that the battle must begin again. And at the heart of that cosmic struggle was blood, the food of the gods. On the high platforms of the great temple, where steps climbed like a mountain of stone toward the heavens, The ritual of the heart sacrifice unfolded with solemn precision. The captive was led upward, past walls painted with serpents, past banners that fluttered in the wind, past the faces of thousands watching from below. The drums thundered, not wildly, but with a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the beating heart itself, as if preparing it for its final purpose. At the summit stood the stone of sacrifice, polished by centuries of bodies, its surface cold against bare flesh. The captive was stretched across it, arms and legs pinned by attendants whose strength came not from cruelty, but from duty, for the moment was not theirs to question. Theirs was only to hold, to ensure that the god would receive what he demanded. The priest approached with the obsidian blade, its edge sharper than any metal, a shard born from the earth's own fire. He lifted it to the sun, letting the light glint upon its black surface, and then he brought it down in a motion that was swift yet deliberate. There was no hesitation. The blade pierced the chest, found its mark, and opened the chamber where life itself resided. The heart, still trembling with its final beats, was raised high, lifted toward the blazing sky. Blood ran down the priest's arms, staining his garments, dripping onto the stone below. The heart itself was offered upward, shown to the heavens so the sun might feed upon its energy, so that its warmth would continue to fall upon the earth. In that gesture, the Aztecs believed they were sustaining the very cosmos. Without it, the sun would falter, darkness would spread, the world would end. When the offering was complete, the heart was placed in a sacred vessel, often a stone container carved with the faces of gods. The body, now empty of its most vital flame, was rolled down the temple steps, tumbling before the eyes of the crowd. It struck the ground with a final thud, and from there it might be carried away, sometimes given to warriors as a mark of honour, sometimes taken apart in rituals that mingled death with remembrance. This was not done in secret. It was not hidden in shadows. It was the most public of ceremonies, a performance witnessed by thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, in the grand plazas of the capital. For the sacrifice was not only a gift to the gods, but also a display of power, a reminder that the empire was strong enough to capture enemies, to bend them to ritual, to feed the heavens with their lives. Each heart torn from a chest was also a message, that the Aztec people commanded the favour of the divine because they alone gave what was required. Yet within this act of spectacle, there was more than cruelty. There was a profound belief that life itself was a loan, borrowed from the gods at birth and returned through death. To surrender the heart was not seen as senseless destruction, but as repayment, as fulfillment of a debt owed to the powers who had shaped the world. Without such gifts, creation itself would collapse. The chosen victims were not always strangers or captured foes. In some rituals, it was those raised within the empire itself who walked the steps, their lives shaped from childhood for the role of offering. They were treated with reverence, adorned with finery, honoured as living embodiments of divine power. To die upon the altar was, in its own way, the highest honour, to become one with the sun, to join the endless struggle in the heavens. The priests who performed these acts bore the marks of their duty upon their bodies. Their hair was long and matted, their skin darkened with soot and blood, their garments seff with the dried remnants of countless sacrifices. They were feared, yes, but also revered, for they carried the burden of ensuring the cosmos endured. Their hands were instruments of continuity, their blades tools not of cruelty, but of cosmic necessity. The scale of these rituals could be staggering. During great festivals, when entire campaigns of conquest had yielded hundreds or even thousands of captives, the sacrifices unfolded in waves, one after another, hearts rising and falling like an unbroken tide. Drums pounded without pause, smoke choked the air, and the steps of the temple ran slick with blood. For days the ceremonies could continue, a ceaseless cycle of death meant to feed the heavens. Foreign eyes, when they beheld such things, saw only horror. They called it savagery, an abomination. They could not understand a worldview where blood was not simply blood, but energy, a divine essence without which the universe itself would unravel. To the Aztecs, the heart was not mere flesh, but a spark of the sun, a fragment of cosmic fire carried within the chest of every living being. To give it back was to restore balance, to ensure the rising of tomorrow's dawn. The people did not turn from these sights. They did not shrink in fear. They watched, and in their watching, they participated. The sacrifice was theirs as much as the victims. When the heart was raised, they believed the sun itself was fed, and when the body fell, they felt the assurance that tomorrow would come, that maize would grow, that rivers would flow. The horror was theirs, but so too was the hope. In the silence after the drums, when the smoke of copal drifted through the plaza, the enormity of what had been done sank into the stone. The temple walls absorbed the cries, the steps bore the stains, the air carried the memory. And yet life continued. Markets reopened, laughter returned, children played, maize cooked in clay pots. For the sacrifice was not the end, but the guarantee that all of this could go on. The heart, torn from the body, was not wasted. It became the bridge between earth and sky, between flesh and flame, between the mortal and the eternal. To the Aztecs, there was no greater gift. To them, the tearing of hearts was not destruction. It was creation renewed, the fire of life rekindled in the heavens above. And so, beneath the ever-watchful sun, the rituals endured, each beat of each heart offered ensuring that the sky would blaze once more, that dawn would return, and that the fragile order of the world would hold for another day. Beneath the wide sky of the Valley of Mexico, where temples rose like mountains and markets swelled with life, there stood another monument, one as haunting as it was enduring. It was not carved in smooth stone, nor painted in the bright pigments that adorn the walls of temples. Its form was made from bone, human bone, and it told its story in silence. This was the Tzompantli, the skull rack, a structure that stood near the great temple, where row upon row of human skulls were threaded upon horizontal beams, pale and gleaming beneath the sun. The Tzompantli was more than a gruesome display. It was a statement written in the language of mortality, a reminder that the Aztec world was bound by sacrifice. To walk in its shadow was to feel the weight of hundreds, even thousands of lives surrendered upon the stone of the gods. Each skull once carried a face, a voice, a life that laughed and wept, fought and prayed. Now, together, they formed a wall of silence, a testament to the endless cycle of giving and taking that sustained the cosmos. The rack itself was constructed with deliberate order. Heavy wooden posts anchored it, crossbeams stretched between them, and upon those beams the skulls were strung, pierced through at the temples and left to stare with hollow eyes. With time, the sun bleached them, the wind wore them, and the rain washed them, until they seemed no longer human but otherworldly, masks of bone gazing into eternity. Some were arranged in patterns, forming symmetrical rows that spoke of discipline rather than chaos. This was not a random piling of remains, but an architecture of death. For the Aztecs, the Tzompantli was not only an offering to the gods, but a message to the living. To stand before it was to be reminded of the thin line between life and death, to see how swiftly the body could be transformed from flesh to relic. It declared the might of the empire, showing the fate of those who opposed it. And yet, beyond power and fear, it was also a sacred bridge, a way of ensuring that those who had given their lives continued to serve, their skulls now part of the eternal dialogue between earth and sky. The rituals of sacrifice did not end when the heart was lifted or the body rolled down the steps. The skull was claimed, set aside for this ultimate display. Priests carefully prepared it, sometimes removing the lower jaw to create a uniform appearance, sometimes carving intricate marks upon the bone. What might seem grotesque to foreign eyes was, within the Aztec world, a form of reverence, a way of transforming the mortal into the sacred. At great festivals, when the plazas filled with captives and the altars ran red with blood, the skull rack swelled with new additions. Fresh rows appeared, each skull threaded onto the beams with the same ritual care as the sacrifices themselves. The crowd would see them rise, pale faces joining the assembly of the dead, and in their rising, the power of the gods was renewed. It was not only a structure of wood and bone, it was an idea, a visible symbol of what sustained the empire. The people of Tenochtitlan could not look upon it without remembering the covenant they believed bound them to the gods, the promise that blood would be given so that the sun would rise, that skulls would be offered so that the earth would endure. Each bone upon the rack was a pledge fulfilled, a vow kept. Yet the Tzompantli also served another purpose, one deeply human, one that transcended ritual. It was a place of memory. Each skull carried the story of a life, of a person who had walked upon the earth, who had eaten maize, who had gazed at the same sky. For the families of those sacrificed, there was grief, yes, but also pride. Their kin had been chosen. Their blood had nourished the heavens. Their skull had become part of the eternal wall. In this way, the Tzompantli was not only a monument of fear, but also one of remembrance. Foreign chroniclers, when they first beheld it, were struck with horror. They wrote of it in tones of disbelief, describing thousands of skulls, gleaming white in the sun, a spectacle beyond comprehension. To them, it was proof of savagery, of barbarity, of cruelty beyond reason. But they did not see what the Aztecs saw. They did not feel the cosmic weight of the sacrifice, the necessity of feeding the gods. They saw only death, while the Aztecs saw renewal. The skull rack was not unique to Tenochtitlan alone. Across the empire, in cities large and small, similar structures rose. Each one carried the same meaning. Each one bound the people closer to their gods. But none matched the scale of the capitals, where the great temple loomed and where the empire's power gathered like the waters of a river. There, the Tzompantli grew into something monumental, a forest of skulls whose number staggered the imagination. Archaeology has uncovered fragments of these racks, skulls pierced and aligned, the remains of what once was. The bones speak still, silent but eloquent, whispering of the ceremonies that fed the sun, of the rituals that painted the plaza red, of the endless tide of life turned into offering. They are reminders that the Aztec world was built not only on maize and stone, but on the steady surrender of human life to divine hunger. Yet even in its silence, the wall of skulls had its own kind of music. The wind whistled through the hollow eye sockets, the rain tapped upon the bone, the sun cast shadows across their pale surfaces. At night, under the moon, they gleamed faintly, a ghostly assembly watching over the sleeping city. In their stillness, they bore witness to the passing of seasons, to the rising and falling of empires, to the endless cycle of time itself. Those who gazed upon the Tzompantli did not turn away. To the Aztec eye, it was not only a warning, not only a reminder of mortality, but also a reassurance. For as long as skulls lined the racks, as long as hearts rose upon the altars, the gods were fed, the sun would rise, the rains would fall, the world would endure. The wall of skulls was the very heartbeat of the empire, carved not in stone, but in bone. And so it stood, year after year, a monument of silence, a forest of faces stripped of flesh, but not of meaning. Each hollow eye was a window into the belief that bound a people to their gods, each row of skulls a verse in the endless song of sacrifice. It was death, yes, but it was also life, for without it, the sun itself would falter. The Sompant Li was not merely decoration. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the axis where mortality met eternity, where the living and the dead joined in service to the cosmos. To walk before it was to stand at the edge of understanding, to see that within the Aztec world, the line between horror and holiness was thin, almost invisible, and that in the eyes of the gods the two were one. Of course, the rack of skulls gleamed white in the sun by day, but as twilight fell and the shadows lengthened across the city, another rhythm stirred. The empire lived not only by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the turning of its sacred calendar. A great wheel of ritual that spun ceaselessly. Each season brought its offerings, each god its share, and when certain nights arrived, the city transformed itself into a theatre of devotion, where no darkness was left empty, no silence unbroken. These were the festivals, days that bled into nights, nights that stretched until the stars themselves seemed to tremble with the weight of ceremony. Tenochtitlan pulsed with life when such occasions came. The plazas filled with dancers, their bodies painted in brilliant colours, their faces hidden behind masks of jaguars, serpents, and gods. Torches blazed against the walls of temples. Smoke curled upward in thick streams, and the sound of drums did not falter. From the smallest household to the towering great temple, the city became one body, moving in rhythm, breathing as one, singing to the unseen powers that governed existence. Yet beneath the music and dance, beneath the laughter of children weaving through crowds, there lingered always the deeper truth, that every festival, no matter how joyous in appearance, was built upon the foundation of sacrifice. Each song was a hymn to death, each step of the dance a preparation for the blood that would flow, each torchlight a reminder of the fire that consumed flesh in offering. For the Aztec people, there could be no celebration without death, no renewal without surrender. The calendar itself was a sacred map, guiding the rituals with precision. One festival might honour the god of rain, another the lord of maize, another the goddess of salt, another the flayed god whose skin promised renewal. Each had its place, each demanded its gift. The people prepared for months, gathering food, weaving costumes, training dancers, but above all, securing the captives who would embody the role of divine nourishment. Without them, the festival could not be complete. When night fell, the boundaries of ordinary time dissolved. Fires burned at every corner, casting long shadows across painted walls. Priests emerged from temple chambers, their bodies streaked with blood and soot, their hair uncut, their faces masked in obsidian and feathers. They moved among the crowds with an otherworldly presence, half human, half divine, embodiments of the gods themselves. To look upon them was to see not a man, but a god walking the earth for a brief, terrible moment. The sacrifices did not always come at once. They unfolded with the rhythm of the night, timed to the music of the drums, to the chants of the people, to the unseen movements of the stars. One by one, captives were led to the steps, their cries swallowed by the pounding of instruments and the roar of the crowd. Their blood flowed in streams that glistened in the torchlight, staining the stone, feeding the earth. Each heart lifted was a spark cast into the darkness, each death a promise that the cycle of life would endure. And yet the festivals were not only for the gods, they were for the people too. Moments when the weight of existence, the fear of famine, the dread of celestial collapse, was transformed into unity. In the shared gaze of thousands watching the altar, in the shared rhythm of feet upon the plaza stones, the people felt themselves bound not only to the gods, but to one another. The festival was a weaving of life and death, a tapestry in which each person was a thread. The nights seemed endless because they belonged to eternity. Time during the festival did not pass in hours, but in beats of drums, in flickers of firelight, in the cries of the sacrificed. There were moments when the city itself seemed to vanish, when the boundary between the mortal and the divine dissolved, when all that existed was the sound of bone flutes, the scent of burning copal, the sight of blood upon stone. These moments stretched into infinity, and the people surrendered themselves to them willingly, knowing that to lose themselves was to become part of the cosmic whole. Not every festival was the same. Some carried the joy of renewal, with costumes bright and dances playful, where men and women became jaguars or hummingbirds, embodying the animals sacred to their gods. Others were grim, solemn, heavy with the weight of death, where silence was broken only by the steady drum and the sharp cry of the victim. But all shared the same essence, the exchange of life for life, the surrender of the human to sustain the divine. Children, elders, warriors and nobles all took part, not always as victims, but as participants in the rituals that filled the nights. They carried offerings, they sang hymns, they feasted upon the food prepared in honour of the gods. They danced until their bodies ached, they wept when the sacrifices were made, they laughed when the songs lifted. To live through the festivals was to be reminded that existence itself was a fragile loan, and that only through ritual could it be renewed. The skull racks grew fuller during these times, their pale faces illuminated by torchlight. The scent of burning flesh mingled with flowers strewn upon the plazas. The air was thick with incense, yet beneath it all, the copper tang of blood lingered. To the outsider, it may have seemed unbearable, but to the Aztec, it was the smell of survival, of life purchased for another season, another year. Even as exhaustion claimed the dancers, even as the fires burned low, the festivals pressed onward. Sleep was set aside, for these nights belonged not to the body, but to the soul. The people endured the weight of the rituals, their eyes heavy but their spirits lifted by the certainty that what they gave would be returned to them in maize, in rain, in the rising sun. When dawn finally came, it was not quiet. The first light touched a city still echoing with drums, still reeking of smoke and blood. The sacrifices had ended, but their presence lingered upon the stones, upon the racks of skulls, upon the weary faces of those who had watched. The festivals closed not with silence, but with continuation, as life flowed back into the markets, the homes, the fields. Yet beneath the daily rhythm, the memory of the night remained, pulsing like a second heartbeat, reminding the people that their lives were bound to the gods in a covenant sealed with blood. For in the Aztec world, festivals were not diversions. They were not escapes from reality. They were reality itself, made visible, made audible, made undeniable. Each endless night was a mirror of the cosmos, a reenactment of the creation, a reminder that the world could only endure through sacrifice. And so long as the fires burned, so long as the drums echoed, so long as the blood flowed, the people believed that tomorrow would dawn once more. The fires of the festivals had scarcely dimmed when another hunger stirred, not among the gods, but among men. For the Aztec Empire did not stand still. It stretched outward, growing with the same inevitability as the rising sun. The rituals that bound the people to their gods also bound them to war, for the altars required captives, and captives could not be conjured from stone or maize. They had to be taken, seized from battlefields, dragged from foreign cities, brought in chains to the beating heart of Tenochtitlan. The gods demanded blood, but the empire demanded more. Tribute, loyalty, submission. To fulfill both, war became ritual, and ritual became war. The Flower Wars, as they came to be called, were battles fought not solely for land or plunder, but for bodies. Armies marched beneath banners of eagles and jaguars, not only to defend borders or conquer towns, but to capture men who would climb the steps of temples and offer their lives to the sun. In this way, the empire fed the gods, and in feeding the gods, it fed its own authority. Cities that resisted felt the double weight of conquest. Defeat brought not only the loss of sovereignty, but the loss of sons and brothers, who were led away to be sacrificed beneath foreign skies. The sight of them bound and marched towards Tenochtitlan was itself a weapon, a silent message to all who considered defiance. Resistance meant death in battle, and beyond death, the certainty of the altar. Even the vanquished could not escape service to the gods. The hunger grew as the empire expanded. Each victory required its offering. Each conquest a greater display of devotion. A single captive was no longer enough. Dozens were demanded, then hundreds, then thousands. Great festivals became stages where mountains of prisoners were slain in unbroken succession, their hearts raised to the sky, their bodies rolling down temple steps in rivers of blood. It was said that during the dedication of the great temple, tens of thousands were sacrificed over days that seemed to dissolve into a blur of drums and cries. Whether the numbers were exaggerated by later chroniclers matters less than the truth they reveal. That the scale of death was immense, almost unimaginable. The empire measured its strength not only in tribute of maize, cotton, and cacao, but in the count of skulls upon the racks. Each captive fed the gods, but also fed the image of Aztec power. Allies saw it, and were reminded of loyalty's necessity. Enemies saw it and trembled. The empire demanded that all who lived within its shadow contribute to the cycle, whether through crops sent as tribute or blood spilled upon the altar. Warriors trained from youth to fight not for the kill, but for the capture. The strike of the macahuitl, edged with obsidian blades, was aimed not to slay, but to maim, to drop an enemy alive onto the ground where he could be bound and led away. To bring home a captive was to gain honour, to climb the ladder of status, to wear the feathers of the eagle or the spotted cloak of the jaguar. The battlefield itself became a prelude to the ritual, a hunting ground for bodies destined for sacrifice. And still, the hunger never ceased. The sun rose each day, and with it came the unspoken reminder that more blood was owed. Victories that once satisfied the empire no longer sufficed. The gods demanded ever greater demonstrations, and the empire, in its pride, sought to meet them. The wheel of conquest spun faster, drawing in more cities, more captives, more lives. What had begun as ritual necessity grew into imperial policy, entwining religion with politics until neither could be separated from the other. The people bore the weight of this insatiable demand. Tribute flowed in endless streams, baskets of maize, cloaks of cotton, cacao beans counted like coins, but above all, captives. Families in conquered cities lived with the knowledge that their sons might be taken, not just to serve foreign masters, but to die upon foreign altars. The empire's greatness was built not only on stone and gold, but on the bodies of those it consumed. Even allies, bound by treaty rather than conquest, felt the pressure. Their rulers knew that to deny captives was to risk the wrath of Tenochtitlan, to risk becoming the next target of war. Thus, even without open rebellion, the empire demanded lives from those who served it. In peace as in war, the altar was never empty. The plaza of Tenochtitlan reflected this hunger. The skull racks grew denser, their beams groaning beneath the weight of countless heads. The steps of the great temple grew slick with sacrifice. The air thickened with smoke and blood, the sound of drums echoing without end. For the empire, this was proof of its strength. For the people, it was reassurance that the gods remained satisfied. Yet beneath the surface, the question lingered. How much more could be demanded? How far could the hunger stretch before it consumed all? To the Aztec mind, the demand was endless because creation itself was endless. The world had been built upon sacrifice, upon the death of gods who tore themselves apart to form the earth and sky. Humans, as their descendants, were bound to repeat this act, to mirror it in their own flesh. The empire's duty was to ensure the gods were never left wanting, to carry the burden of sustaining the cosmos through conquest. And so, when empires demanded more, the Aztecs gave more. Not willingly, not always with joy, but with the certainty that it was necessary. The blood of captives was the mortar that held their world together, the fire that lit their sun, the rain that fed their fields. To deny it was to invite collapse. To resist it was to invite destruction. The cycle tightened its grip until neither war nor ritual could exist without the other. Each conquest became a festival, each festival a conquest. The hunger of the gods was reflected in the hunger of the empire, and together they consumed all that lay within reach. It was a covenant written not in words but in blood, signed upon the stones of temples, sealed with the hearts of men. And in that covenant lay both the glory and the doom of the Aztec world. When the drums finally fell silent, the city itself seemed to exhale. The air hung heavy with smoke and copper tang, the echoes of chants still lingering in the stone as though unwilling to fade. The plaza that had moments before thundered with sound now stood in uncanny stillness, broken only by the low crackle of torches and the faint hiss of burning incense. The cries had ended, the hearts had been offered, the gods fed, and in the wake of such frenzy, a silence deeper than words descended upon Tenochtitlan. The great temple loomed against the night sky, its steps slick, its summit crowned by fire. Priests moved like shadows across its surface, their bodies streaked with blood, their faces hidden behind masks that no longer roared but seemed suddenly vacant, emptied of the voices that had driven them. Warriors stood at the foot of the pyramids, their painted skins drying, their banners drooping as if the wind itself had grown tired. The captives were gone, their bodies carried into the abyss of ritual, and without them, the vast square seemed both immense and hollow, as though the very stones understood what had been lost. For the people who had gathered, the silence was not absence, but fulfillment. They did not expect joy in this moment, nor relief, but the still weight of balance restored. The gods had been given their due, the cycle continued, and for now, only for now, the world would endure. Mothers pulled children close, not to shield them from horror, but to reassure them that the sun would rise again. Elders whispered prayers into the darkness, soft and steady, their words drifting like threads across the crowd. The silence was never pure. It carried with it the sense of sacrifice, copal smoke curling sweetly, mingling with the iron tang that clung to the stones. Dogs barked at the edges of the plaza, unsettled by what they could not comprehend. Somewhere beyond the city's canals, a heron cried into the night, its wings brushing the surface of the water like the whisper of a forgotten god. Yet in the heart of the city, all was stilled, as though even the lake had paused in its gentle lapping against the causeways. The skull racks loomed nearby, pale shapes in the torchlight, their rows of hollow eyes catching the fire's glow. They did not speak, did not move, but in their mute presence they deepened the silence. For those who looked upon them, the quiet was filled with memory of sons taken, of brothers lost, of strangers bound in wars far from home. Every skull was a voice that no longer cried, a heart that no longer beat. Together they formed a chorus that could not be heard yet was always felt, pressing in from the edges of the mind. Priests began their slow work of cleansing, though cleansing in such a place could never be complete. They poured water down the temple steps, its flow catching the light. A pale stream slipping into the darkness below. They burned more incense, its smoke climbing into the night like the last remnants of prayer. The silence did not lift with these acts. Instead it seemed to grow heavier, as if the city itself had inhaled too deeply and now held its breath. In houses across Tenochtitlan, families returned to their hearths. Food was shared in hushed tones, maize and beans eaten without festivity, for such nights were not for celebration. They were nights of acknowledgement, of quiet gratitude that life still continued. Candles flickered in alcoves, casting long shadows across walls painted with gods who had been fed once more. Children, weary from watching, drifted into sleep while their parents murmured to the unseen forces above, offering thanks, offering pleas that this gift would suffice for another day. Out upon the lake, silence spread even more deeply. Canoes rocked gently, their oars left still. The stars, mirrored in the black water, seemed to hang lower, closer, as though curious about the events of the city. Fishermen who had watched from afar did not speak of what they had seen, for to name it was to break the fragile balance of night. They let the silence settle over them like a shroud, knowing it was not emptiness, but a kind of presence, a reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. In the palace, rulers and nobles sat in their chambers, their minds quiet, not from peace, but from the gravity of the ritual. For them, silence was political as much as spiritual. Each offering of captives secured not only the favour of the gods, but the obedience of the people. Yet they too felt the weight of what had been done. The empire thrived upon blood, but blood left stains that could not be fully washed away. In the stillness of the night, even the most powerful rulers felt the shadow of mortality pass over them, whispering that no crown, no throne, no city could escape the same end that had claimed the captives. The silence stretched on, and in it, a kind of understanding took shape. This was not a silence of peace, but of suspension, of waiting. It was the silence of fields after the rain has stopped, when the earth holds its breath before sprouting anew. It was the silence of a battlefield after the clash has ended, when the dead lie still and the living stare into nothingness. It was the silence of ritual fulfilled, when the cries of men and the roar of drums dissolve into something vaster, something that presses against the edges of human comprehension. In that silence, the city remembered. It remembered the gods who had sacrificed themselves to bring forth sun and earth, tearing their own bodies apart, so that humans might walk upon soil, drink from rivers, gaze upon stars. It remembered that silence is never absence, but debt, the debt of life owed to death. the debt of creation owed to destruction. Every stillness carried within it the echo of all that had been taken, all that had been offered. As the night deepened, the silence did not lighten, but grew darker, heavier. A blanket pulled across the city. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it was thick with dreams. People dreamed of temples rising out of mist, of rivers running red into the lake, of suns that faltered and needed to be pushed once more across the sky with hands and hearts. The silence carried those dreams, cradled them, whispered them into the ears of those who slumbered. The gods too were silent. They did not answer, did not speak, but in their quietness the people found reassurance. Silence was not abandonment, it was acceptance. The gods did not need to cry out when they had been fed. Their stillness mirrored the city's own, a vast and distant calm that stretched beyond the stars. And so, Tenochtitlan rested, wrapped in its silence. The fires burned lower, the incense thinned, the skull racks gleamed faintly in the fading light. No more cries rose from the temples, no more drums shook the ground. Only the silence remained, vast and unbroken, settling into the bones of the city like the slow seep of night. When dawn came, it would bring the sound of life again, markets stirring, children laughing, oars slapping against the lake. But for now, the silence was all. It was the final offering, the final act of devotion, the final acknowledgement that, after the frenzy of sacrifice, after the thunder of drums, after the tearing of hearts, what remained was not emptiness but stillness, silence after the sacrifice. And so as the drums fade into silence, and the torches of Tenochtitlan burn low, we step away from a world built upon blood and belief. Tonight we have walked through a city where the sun itself was thought to hunger, where hearts were lifted to the heavens, and where fear and faith intertwined until they were one and the same. We have seen temples rising above the lake, like mountains carved by men, their steps darkened with sacrifice. We have stood among captives led in chains, among priests with obsidian knives, among crowds who believed with every breath that their offerings kept the world alive. And in the quiet that followed, we heard the silence that fell across the empire, a silence not of peace, but of balance restored. It is a history both haunting and mesmerizing, a story that reminds us how far belief can drive a people, and how fragile human life once was beneath the shadow of the sun. But now, I'd like to turn to you. As you listened, what moment stayed with you most? Was it the drums that echoed like thunder? The children of Tarlok? The hearts torn for the heavens? Or the endless skulls upon the wall? Each detail tells us something not only about the Aztecs, but about the way humans everywhere have struggled to explain the forces that rule over us. Before you drift into sleep, share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of this story lingered in your mind? Your reflections are like small lights scattered across the map of this channel, shining back into the past we explore together. And if you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe. It helps these histories find others who may be listening tonight, somewhere far away, under a different sky. Because in the end, history is not only about the past, it is about the voices that keep remembering. Thank you for joining me this evening. Rest well, and may your dreams be quieter than the stories we have told.